6:33, and a difficult day for the government hasn't stopped with all that I have told you so far. How to respond to accusations of anti-Muslim statements by the former Conservative Deputy Chairman, Lee Anderson, and the former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, have dogged Tory MPs all day. Let's start with what happens when the government sends out a minister, in this case the hapless illegal migration minister Michael Tomlinson, not properly prepared to answer obvious questions. And he bumps into my colleague Nick Ferrari.
We agree it was wrong, but why was it wrong?
Nick, it was wrong. What Lee
but why was
said,
it wrong?
What he said was wrong. As a result of what he said, the whip was removed from him. That was robust action.
No,
that was
why
robust
was it
action
wrong?
that was
That's
taken.
what I'm trying to get at.
It was wrong, Nick, because of what he said, and robust action was taken as a result.
You're well educated. Let's try this a different way. Was it Islamophobic?
What he said was wrong, and robust action was taken, and the whip was removed within 24 hours.
Minister, was it Islamophobic?
Nick, it was wrong.
Minister, I'm going to, and I'm normally a very polite man, I'm actually going to effectively put the fact, I'll ask you now for the third time, I've asked you 6 times why it was necessary. For the third time, was it Islamophobic?
Nick, it was wrong.
I'll have to curtail the interview there. I'm grateful for your time, but enough already.
Oof. Tomlinson's boss, James Cleverly, said that Lee Anderson should apologise for his claim that Sadiq Khan, the London mayor, had given away the capital city to his Muslim mates, because that was not true. But with Anderson leaving dangling the possibility that he might yet defect to Reform UK, and the Daily Telegraph reporting this as Hurricane Lee threatens to tear the Tories apart, this story isn't going away. I'm joined by the former Scottish Conservative leader, now co-presenter of the new Sky podcast, Electoral Dysfunction, Baroness Ruth Davidson. Ruth, very good to see you there. Can I start by assuming that you do know why Lee Anderson had the Tory whip withdrawn, and you do understand why his comments were more than wrong?
Yeah, well, I think I tweeted at the time, Andrew, that it was offensive bollocks to say that the okay. London mayor was, that he'd been in the control, that Islamists had control of him, and that he'd passed the city over to his Islamist mates. And the reason that it's wrong is because it's conflating a Muslim mayor with Islamism, which is an extremism and one that carries a level of threat. And it's making that link because of his faith. It's also suggesting that somebody who holds high office, who's incredibly qualified for that office, and whether you agree with his policies or not, and we should always argue on the policies, is captured by an ideology because of his faith. And if you look at examples in history, it's the same as when people suggested, or when Republicans were running against JFK, saying that he couldn't be a president for all Americans because he would just do what the Pope said because he was a Roman Catholic. Or it would be similar if you tipped it on your head and said that a Jewish mayor of London would do whatever the state of Israel said, or Netanyahu said. And when you start making these comparisons, then you realise exactly why it's offensive and also why it's nonsense.
Absolutely. And yet, talking to quite a few Conservative MPs around Westminster today, there are people inside the party who say the whole value of Lee Anderson is that he speaks his truth. He speaks roughly. He speaks like ordinary voters. They acknowledge him, and they want him, and the Conservative Party should be very, very careful in expelling people like him and perhaps seeing them joining Reform.
Well, look, I've never been one that gussies up their words. You can speak plainly without saying things that are wrong, without saying things that are racist, and without saying things that are Islamophobic. And I think that there are a number of colleagues around Westminster that also need to maybe get out a bit more if they think that people that they want to speak to in fictitious collections of constituencies like this red wall we hear so much about, that they necessarily want to hear that sort of thing either, because there seems to be this sense somewhere that we can't have decency in politics, that we can't debate on the issues, that we can't have conversations about difficult, complex, sometimes conflicting subjects like migration, but do it in a manner in which you can be proud of your elected representatives.
Right, and I know that you're launching this new podcast, and it's going to be talking about all of politics, but I'm really interested in your views about what is happening to the Conservative Party at the moment, because there does seem to be a kind of fragmenting or a splintering to the right, to the hard right, and even people like the Prime Minister is very, very nervous about that process. Why do you think the Conservative Party seems to be tilting so much to the right?
Yeah, well, I think splintering is a good word, actually, because I think that the Conservative Party has always been a very broad church, and there was a time where, a wet like me was kind of in the kind of broad centre of what was represented in government in terms of ministers. So I was never a minister, I was never in government, but for example, in a Cameron cabinet, I would have probably ideologically
You'd have slotted in quite well.
To people.
Yeah.
What's that? Yeah, I would have slotted in.
You'd have slotted in
I'm not
quite
saying
well.
that I had the skills or the expertise to do it, but ideologically, I would have felt very comfortable in that sort of space with a Justine Greening and a David Gauke and a David Liddington and others like that. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that any particular strand of any party has a right to be in the ascendancy forever. Of course I'm not. It always swings around. But I do think we just have to be a little bit careful that if we want to have Conservative governments in future and Conservative policies in future and get elected, that we can't just talk to an ever-dwindling number of our people that are already supporters. We also have to talk over the heads of the party and talk to the wider country. And I think that particularly with the number of leadership elections that we've had lately, we've seen very core vote strategy from a number of candidates. And yes, they've absolutely found success with that. But that's talking to a very small number of people who happen to have a membership card of the Conservative Party,
yes.
and it's not talking to those swing voters that you need to actually take the country and form a government.
And we both know there are millions upon millions of kind of moderate centrists, don't talk out very much, Conservatives all over the place, who perhaps don't feel quite so well represented at the moment. Can I ask you?
Yeah, and I think, if you look at somebody who I never had a particularly strong or positive relationship with, which is Boris Johnson. We had a clash of personalities.
I remember it well. Yes. And there were, people seem to have taken the lesson of his election as if you go really far right, you'll win a stonking great majority. But actually, people remember, Boris isn't really thought of prior to being a Brexit Prime Minister as being of the right. In terms of his mayoralship of London, he was considered to be kind of cosmopolitan and liberal and fundamentally unconservative in areas of morality and certainly sexual morality, in terms of the amount of large projects he wanted to fund. He wasn't particularly fiscally conservative. So I think maybe some people have taken the wrong lessons from that. Yes. Do you think there's a way back for Lee Anderson?
I think there was when all of this broke on Friday. I think it's very difficult for him now, because the Lee Anderson who on Saturday morning and came out and said, "Look, don't worry, I don't mind that the Prime Minister has taken the whip off me because he had no choice," is now it seems to be a different Lee Anderson from the one today who's saying, you can't apologise for these things if you mean it. It's a sign of weakness. I will never apologise for this. I'm now sitting down with Richard Tice, the head of Reform, and having private one-to-one.
And so, to be clear, you think if he doesn't apologise, he shouldn't be standing as a Conservative at the next election?
No, I honestly think there has to be a level of contrition there. There has to be at least a level of recognition as well about why there are so many people that are deeply uncomfortable and offended by what he said. People that, aren't Muslim, who, don't follow Islam, but who can absolutely understand that people are not defined by the church or temple or mosque or gurdwara that they worship at.
This is a really interesting moment for a lot of Conservative MPs, reading the runes, looking at the polls, and quite a few of them are beginning to think, maybe I'll be better off with Reform UK. Maybe it's time to jump ship. Do you fear that Lee Anderson and others are thinking that way?
Well, I think there are a number of MPs who, up until maybe October, November, were still hoping that the next election could be a 1992 style election. I think there's more and more of them that are coming to the belief that it's going to be a 1997 style election, and that raises huge question marks for them. However, I think if you look at recent breakaway parties, splinter parties, the idea that a reform would have any more success than a UKIP or that one that Chuka Umunna set up with,
Change UK.
Yeah, Change UK, or it seems to me for the birds.
Yeah. Yes. Very good. Can I ask about your general sense of what's going on with the Muslim community? Because I had Navid Asgarana, who is a Muslim, conservative Muslim, leading the community in Glasgow on the show yesterday. And he seemed really genuinely upset and distressed by some of the language being used about Muslims generally. I'm now not talking about Lee Anderson or any particular individual conservative, but about the position of Muslims in the political community. Many Muslims have been kind of natural conservatives, and yet they're feeling very much put off at the moment by the party.
Well, I think that I feel desperately sad, actually, that in all of this conversation that we've had following that vote last Wednesday in the House of Commons about how vulnerable MPs feel, how they're worried for their security, etc., we've had so little conversation about how vulnerable both Muslim and Jewish communities across the United Kingdom feel. And they do feel vulnerable. And they feel vulnerable because that level of public discourse and debate is so inflamed at the moment. And if MPs sitting in Westminster talking about this feel, for all the kind of protection that they have put around them, if they feel vulnerable, think about ordinary people that are living in communities that feel under threat and under fire, and they feel that they've got no power. They don't sit in the place that makes the laws. They don't have armed police standing outside their office when they go to their work. They feel utterly alone. So I do think that actually there's a little bit of kind of walking a mile in somebody else's shoes that needs to happen here.